Welcome to the 18th Annual Entertainment and Media Global Outlook. I'm Deborah Bothun, and I have the pleasure of being the Global Entertainment and Media Leader for PwC's. As you know, we are live today, and I want a special welcome to those of you here in the studio at 300 Madison in New York City, as well as the over 75 client leaders that are watching us live from Germany, and the others that are watching us all over the world. We've done some things a little bit different this year with respect to how we gather information and how we get ready to collect all the data for the Outlook. In addition to having several workshops where we had some of you in the room and others vet the ideas and the research that we had, we also did a preview of the Entertainment and Media Outlook data and themes in China. I was there several weeks ago, and I have to tell you, that is one of the most perfect places to preview and to discuss some of the themes that we're going to talk today, because the experiences there are extremely immersive. There's a lot of companies like Baidu, Tencent, who are really leveraging technology to create a unique user experience. For instance, last year when I traveled around the world, and I commented on it a year ago at the Outlook, I said, the changes are accelerating faster and faster and faster. Well, this year what I felt, and not to be too trite, but I really felt like this incredible speed is our new normal. That's just our life. We are actually acting a little bit like our kids for some of you in the room. We're acting a little bit younger, we're a little bit more mobile, we're a little bit more digital. Why? Because we don't really have any choice but to act that way in our personal and our professional lives. And so therefore, we're influencing a lot of the ways that our business is run. And in fact, many businesses in this room have also moved quite a ways down that path in the last year towards being a much more technology-enabled, user, consumer-centric organization. This year, more than ever, we have really gotten on the ground around the world. I just mentioned the trip to China and several other countries, but we've also spoken to our country leaders in 54 countries, which you'll hear about in a few minutes from Stefanie, about the data. Does it make sense? Do the themes resonate? What's different about this country on the ground than the average? Because you hear a lot about averages when you talk about global big numbers. And just remember, whenever you hear those, there are lots of differences when you get on the ground in every country, when you get on the ground and are talking about specific segments. So I always want to put that out there relative to any numbers that you hear, because it is not your number in your segment. It is not your number in your country when we talk about global averages. All of the work that we have done, as many of you know, I recognize many faces in the room, culminates in a 5-year forecast. Now, you probably got, when you were upstairs, 3 or 4 different documents. One of them is a magazine that we work with Strategy on Business on. In fact, I was at the airport at JFK the other day, was able to pick my copy right up in the airport, which, you know, for me, I'm like a real media person, so that was pretty cool. And we have some of our thought leadership articles in there, which you'll see on artificial intelligence. We've got an interview with Shelley Palmer, which was a lot of fun, as well as Chris Vollmer's article on fan centricity. You'll get to see him a little bit later this morning. The other document that you got was the actual Outlook pamphlet that has some of the high-level data, a couple of steps down from what you're going to hear about today, as well as 6 other articles that drill deeply into things like deals and strategy, security, etc. So the other thing I want to say before I turn it over to my partner Stefanie is that I want you to be involved in this experience today. So it is perfectly acceptable to be on your phone as long as the sound is off, if you're going to tweet about what you're hearing today, and you'll see live some of those directly in front of you. So with that Curtain up, Stefanie Kane.
All right, thank you, Deborah. I'm not afraid of you guys. I was told it looks better to stand back here for the camera. I was getting used to all this live stuff, but thank you, Deborah. Good morning to everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. My job this morning, I've done this a couple times, I recognize a lot of faces, is to put out there for you just a brief overview of the Outlook data, highlight the trends that that data was telling us, and talk to you a little bit about the conclusions that it's led us to draw. And this year, when we were looking at the data, and we stepped back, there were two questions that just kept coming up every time we were looking at it. So you're going to hear a lot of the conversations today touch around that. Let me throw them out at a real high level just to start. So the first question was whether entertainment and media, in terms of revenue growth, is slowing, on a decline, or stagnant, somewhere in the middle. And that's a strange place for us. We haven't really asked that question in a long time. It's not a new question, but the answer seemed to be a little different. And the answer was yes and no. And you're going to see that, and you'll draw your own conclusions as I go through the data today. The second question that kept popping up was an age-old question that we've been asking ourselves in this industry for a long time. Content or distribution? Which one is king? Well, the answer, as we started working through that data, it seemed to be, even if you have great content, even if you have a great distribution channel, or even if you have both, it's not enough anymore. You really need to be leveraging technology and creating a direct, great user experience, a fantastic user experience, if you want to continue to experience the growth that we've been seeing over the past couple of years. So the overarching themes revolve around those topics. And again, you're going to hear it through the discussions today. But the data really highlighted the maturity that we're seeing relative to our industry, even to some extent on the digital side. It spotlights pockets of opportunities, and we're going to talk about that today. It makes clear the impact of technological change, and it also, as I said, makes abundantly clear the absolute necessity to drive a fantastic user experience. Those themes will be, as I said, the discussion topics that both I'll touch on relative to the data, but you're going to hear a lot about what all different companies are doing to address just those instances as we go through the panelists today. For those of you who may be new to the Outlook data, let's just take a step back. Let's talk about what's actually in the Outlook just for a moment, and that'll come up on the slide now. We touch on consumer spending. We analyze consumer spending. We analyze advertising spending. Right? Both of those are revenue forecasts that we look both on a 5-year historical basis and a 5-year projected basis. And included in those numbers are internet access as well. We do this analysis across 17 different segments, and that's expanded from prior years. We've added 2 new segments this year. We added VR and we added esports. And then lastly, the data is substantially consistent, as Deborah said, across 54 countries. With just a few exceptions, we really do try to drill down wherever we have enough aggregated data to touch on the segments in each individual country. The other thing that we did new today and in this year was going back to that principal premise that just kept coming out is that it's all about the user experience. Well, so we decided to aggregate the data at a different level this year. You have all the details, but we took a look, and you'll be able to sort it this way across access, watch, read, play, and listen. Right? It's not perfect as you read through the segments. It's not perfect how they all actually align there, but it really drew some interesting spotlights around where the opportunities are, where the risks are, where the growth is, and to some extent, what's slowing down. And we'll touch on that too a little bit today as well. So here's the global headline that you've been waiting for, coming up on the next slide. There we go, we've got it now. 4.2% cumulative average growth across the industry globally over the next 5 years. That number compares to a GDP of 5.6% over the same time period. And that combination gives you some metrics that are really a stark reality relative to our industry, and you can see that depicted on the slide. So the global entertainment and media revenue, as we measure it, will represent a declining share of global GDP. Our share is declining in terms of spend around the globe. Again, Deborah said these are broad averages. We'll get down a little bit deeper. But the trend line, while it varies by sector and it varies by geography, there's definitely some bright spots in there too, as well. And before we go into these details though, what I thought I'd do is just take a step up, because there's definitely some macro factors that were driving our outlook this year that I think are important to share. So first, just a moment ago, I was very purposeful when I said it's the entertainment and media revenue globally as we measure it. And that's because the universe of what's considered entertainment and media spend is consistently and continually growing. Right? It's expanding into many different areas, several of which have significant potential, but they're not captured directly in the 17 segments that we just put up. Just to give you one example, we know that companies are channeling a portion, and an increasing portion, of their advertising revenue towards e-commerce sites. But those totals across those e-commerce sites are not yet aggregated. Hopefully they will be one day and we can pull that together. Second, as digital markets mature and as the user experience improves, our spending, consumer spending, advertising spending, it's getting more efficient. And with that, it might not grow as rapidly as it has in the last couple of years. Third, it is obvious that industry outlooks, any industry, not just our own, are being impacted by the uncertainty around economic and political changes that are going on all around the world around us. Everyone's really familiar with that. And add to that uncertainty, the uncertainty around the speed of uptake and technological changes. That has a very direct impact to us. So with that, whether it's AI, whether it's VR, whether it's IP protocols, you throw it out there, there's uncertainty around how quickly we can convert those business models and monetize them. And then finally, within our industry for certain, regulatory challenges are evident in every single territory that we look at. We're seeing issues around data privacy, we're seeing issues around security, and the more regulation that comes around those issues, the more difficult it is to actually track that data. And that's the data that we absolutely need to drive that user experience and in turn drive growth. So each one of those 5 factors are pressure points. They're pressure points on growth globally as we look out over the 5 years, and they're reflected in our outlook numbers. But what can you do, therefore, with that as a backdrop, to thrive in this marketplace? To thrive in a marketplace that's increasingly competitive, that may be slower growing, and where content and distribution are important, but they're not enough. Ultimately, our premise is that tomorrow's leading companies will look out today and recognize that growth is going to depend, once again, on getting much closer to the consumer, creating a much greater, intimate, interactive user experience. And across the industry, they're going to create compelling and engaging and intuitive user experiences, those that are easy to get to, easy to work with. So we're seeing that as we're talking to clients around the world in terms of being the primary objectives of investment to drive growth. And technology and data lies right in the center of that. That's the way we're going to get there. Companies who are leveraging technology to get to know the consumers, to build a relationship with them, to involve them in their product, whatever that might be, are the ones who are going to hold the significant advantage. Ultimately, within this slower growth environment, making the right choices between what consumers want, balancing that against what technology can enable today and again tomorrow, is what's going to drive the business models. And with those business models, we'll need data-enabled systems in order to energize, to amplify, and to monetize those consumer experiences. That's what the data is telling us. I've talked at a high level. Let's get to the numbers, because we know you guys like the numbers. So we're going to go there for a couple minutes now. So as I talked about that hypothesis and getting down, what you can see across this slide is that the majority of our traditional industry segments are growing, right? They show growth over the next 5-year term. But that growth on an absolute basis is slower than we've seen it in the past. There's actually only 2 segments, magazines and newspaper, who are going to decline in terms of absolute revenue dollars over the 5-year forecast. And there are some super bright spots there, of course. There's internet video, which is growing at rapid rates. There's internet advertising. There's our newer segments, but of course the dollars there are quite small. But perhaps the most interesting trend that we see here goes back to that GDP line. And once again, you can see that the majority of our segments are going to struggle to grow faster than GDP, and thus they're going to lose share. And when you combine this all together, that's where we get to the global average. And we don't have sufficient growth in our larger segments to offset, we don't have a sufficient growth in our newer segments, to offset the growth in our larger segments. And it turns out that we're looking probably at an industry plateau over the next several years. That's what our forecast is telling us. But again, the details are there. There's some super bright spots. Let's get into some of the details and dive a little bit deeper. Let's talk about advertising. Let's talk about consumer spend and what we're seeing there. Let's start with advertising. So as we mentioned already, there's some pressures around the ad-supported business model. In that regard, there's two stark realities. The first is that many consumers, especially those who are the most desirable, be it the millennials, be it the high net worth spenders, they just don't like watching ads. I mean, quite frankly, which one of us do, right? Who of us would prefer to do it? But we're seeing that come out in rising use of technology to skip ads or to block ads. But maybe more importantly, what the data is telling us is we're also seeing rapid growth in ad light and ad-free subscriptions. So that came out in the data as we look through it this year. Second, around advertising. Overall, global advertising growth is now overwhelmingly driven by internet advertising. In the US, internet advertising in absolute dollars surpassed television advertising in 2016, and that's what you see up here on the screen. And as you can see, we expect that differential to widen as we go out over the forecast period, driven most significantly by mobile advertising. In fact, by the time we reach 2021, our forecast projects that mobile advertising will represent 74.5% of all of the internet advertising out there. And even with the rapidly growing internet advertising market, we're also seeing disparities relative to sharing the wealth. We're seeing huge concentration of where the dollars are going. According to eMarketer's forecasts, Google and Facebook will account for almost 50% of the advertisers' total global digital advertising spend next year. This year, we're in it, 2017, right now. When we hit the end of the year, 50%. And add to that China's Tencent, Alibaba, and Baidu, and they add another 15%. Guys, that's 65% of our global internet advertising concentrated within 5 companies. 5 companies. That's having a huge impact on the publishers. Our traditional publishers are having to rethink their business models. They're having to rethink how they're partnering with third parties so they can continue to get their share. So let's pause here for a minute and talk about why we think we're seeing that phenomenon. I mean, that is a remarkable trend. Why is there this concentration? What do those companies have in common? Well, each one of them has high growth with varying levels in 3 areas: commerce, communication, and content, the 3 C's. We believe that the next super competitor will be a diversified conglomerate with disparate assets, but each one of those assets individually partaking in high digital growth areas. In order for it to work, though, they obviously need to have those assets working together. They need to leverage those synergies greatly. They also need to create a mobile ecosystem around it, and they need to control the user experience, all the way directly to the user. Deborah mentioned it earlier, Tencent. Tencent is a great example of a company who is taking advantage of their unified interface across these 3 C's. They're driving traffic across their mobile desktop, through their chat services, and through their game services. They've created a seamless social and retail shopping experience. So when users are on their social sites or their gaming sites, they're being directed to retailers, which Tencent owns, or at least owns a share of. And once they get to those sites, whether they're service sites or retail sites, they're being encouraged to use TenPay, Tencent's mobile payment application. So again, the full circle. And we're seeing obviously phenomenal growth from that company. In the US, companies like Amazon and then Facebook and Google, which I just mentioned a moment ago, are moving in a similar direction. Again, to varying degrees, but they're moving in that direction. And I think it's a perfect opportunity, it's a perfect entree then. Let's talk about the consumers, because that's who these guys reach. Let's talk a few minutes around our consumer spend trends. On the consumer side of the house, globally and in the US, demand is being pushed by internet access revenue. It's grown above all other categories. In the US, as a matter of fact, access has now exceeded watch, so our video products. In that regard, there's a growing importance that it highlights around connectivity in order to enable consumption. So we talked about it, connectivity to get to e-commerce sites, to get to communication sites, to get to health or financial service sites. And this trend just continues. And you can see watch is going to experience slow growth by the size of the CAGR over the period here in the US. And that's because internet video is being offset by slow growth in cinema, as well as negative growth in larger TV and video segments. There's another pivotal point that I want to talk about, and that's play. So play are the games and games-related activities. They exceeded listen for the first time in 2016. It's increasing internet speeds that are enabling this. It's VR, and it's getting closer to the user. And it's also esports that's in there, which is a great example of how live events are actually getting you closer to the consumer. So with that, it brings us to another central tenet that we've been talking about, and that's that entertainment and media offerings simply cannot thrive without the power of the fans. So again, it's not just the users, it's not just interacting with them, it's actually getting beyond casual eyeballs down to the fans. And in that regard, Chris is going to come up here later, Chris Vollmer, and he's going to do a whole panel just around that, how you become a fantastic company. So lastly, let me get down to just summing this up a little bit. In our world of slower growth, of intense competition for attention, of continual disruption that's challenging our industry, what do? Well, again, there are definitely some high points. There's lots of opportunities, and we need to focus on them. And the data, the analysis, the perspectives that we bring via the perspective and via the outlook this year, it offers you insights on where companies are adapting, where we're seeing companies invest, where we're seeing them experiment, where we're seeing them innovate across the industry. And in part, they fall into these 6 buckets. And you're going to see these 6 buckets aligned to the articles in your material this year around the outlook. Because we think in order to have strategic growth over the time period, a company needs to hit across these metrics, again, to the extent applicable to them. So that would be strategies around content, partaking in deals, dealing with regulation, thinking about scenarios to deal with that, figuring out your position in the value chain, being innovative, and inclusive in that innovation, driving and adapting to new business models. So with those key factors in mind, with a little brief overview of the data, what I want to do is get us right to our panelists who are going to really dive into this with some practical examples. So I want to turn it back over to Deborah with her esteemed panelists to join her, David and Eden, to take us on for the rest of the morning. Thank you.